Hi, I'm just going to make a short video to talk a little bit more about student errors. So your book mentions that there are four types of errors. The first one being performance errors, and those aren't anything to worry about. That can happen to native speakers as well as non-native speakers. It's just when you're speaking, sometimes you make a grammatical error. You know it's an error, and it just happens when you're speaking quickly. The second type of error can be made just from imperfect learning. So that means that a student has been taught a form and has probably practiced a form, but they just haven't mastered it yet. And we know that when we teach students a form, they don't go home that night and just know how to use it correctly, and they'll use it correctly from then on. It's just you introduce a form in class, you have them practice and practice and practice in as many natural ways as possible, as well as look at the form and discuss the form and try to edit the form. And hopefully, at some point, they will master it. It's at what point do they master it? We don't know. It's completely individual, depending on the student and other factors. So it's common that even once a student has been taught a form, doesn't mean that they master it immediately and they're going to immediately use it correctly. Students can also make errors through what we call overgeneralization. And this is really interesting because that's something that L1 learners do too. So what's an L1 learner? Well, we were all L1 learners when we were children. So children acquire their language through their environment and interactions in their environment. We don't teach it to them. I have 6-year-old twins and I don't sit and teach them grammar. They have just learned English through interacting with their family and their friends and their teachers. And they make mistakes in overgeneralization. So my children still tend to overgeneralize ed, simple past endings. So they'll still say things like, she goed to the store. So overgeneralization of rules is common with first language acquisition, L1 learners, as well as second language learners too. And finally, the last type of error that your book mentions is the influence of the native language, or L1 transfer. So meaning if something is a rule, a grammar rule in your first language, learners are likely to transfer that rule to the second language. So that is why the closer the first language is to the target language that's being learned, the easier the second language should be to be learned. So the farther your first language is, or the more different your first language is from the language you're trying to learn, the more difficult it is. So, for example, Spanish and English are very similar. So, oftentimes, if you have Spanish speakers in your class learning English, it will be easier for them to pick it up than someone who speaks Arabic. Okay? And I mean, it doesn't mean that someone who speaks a language that's very different from English won't be able to master it, or that they won't be able to pick it up quickly, because that does happen. It just means that it will be more difficult for them to do so than for someone whose first language is very similar to the target language. Okay, so your book mentions something called interlanguage. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that and pull up some slides too for you. Okay, so what interlanguage is, it's so as students are, or as someone is learning another language, they develop what's called an interlanguage. And what interlanguage is, It's just non-target-like forms. Okay, so when you're learning the target language, everyone develops what's called interlanguage. And this interlanguage may contain elements that don't relate to their first language as well as the target language. However, interlanguages, like all grammars, are rule governed and systematic. Okay? And this is also developmental. Okay, so it's just, what I mean by that, and your book mentions this, it's just everybody goes through this as they're learning another language. Your book also mentioned that in some forms, there's a developmental sequence that learners go through, and which is the exact same as first language acquisition. That there is a sequence to some forms, a developmental sequence that learners will go through. And so as they're going through that, as they're making errors, there may not be anything that a teacher can do about it. It's just part of their language development. And if they keep making an error, it may mean that they're just not ready to move on to the next stage in that development. So what do we do about that? There's nothing you can really do about that. It's just so teachers notice or know that not all errors are a problem with learning or a student not understanding something. It may just be developmental and they're not ready to move on. How do you tell the difference between different errors? Well, you can't always. Okay, errors that are caused from someone's first language, if you know something about that first language, you can tell that that's what it is. But other errors that are developmental, well, there may not be anything you can do about it. So when I'm done talking about interlanguage, we'll talk about how, because there are so many different types of errors and because researchers debate how best to deal with them, we'll talk a little bit about how you can deal with them in classes. Okay, so as your book mentions, there seems to be a continuum of acquisition or stages in the development. And so you can think of the interlanguage as a continuum that develops according to patterns. And so the interlanguage that students develop, it's influenced by a few things. So it's going to be influenced by language transfer, which means what grammatical forms the students are transferring from their first language or even their second language. You know, some of your students could be on their third, fourth, or fifth language. So more than one of those languages could be affecting their language transfer. They could be transferring rules from one or two different languages. Okay, language universal. So what does that mean? So there are some parts of language that are universal to most languages in the world. Okay? Markedness. The way words are added and added to in order to change meaning. So we're going to talk about that a little bit next. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the things that I mentioned that affect the interlanguage that a student develops. So the first one is language transfer. So positive transfer is when the languages are similar. So that's good. So that's, like I said before, the more similar your first language is to the language you are learning, the easier it should be for you to learn that language. Negative transfer occurs when the languages are very different. So when the languages are very different, students will be transferring things that don't match the target language. So they're going to be making more errors, and there are going to be more errors to try to correct so that the students reach that grammatical competence. That is why it's more difficult for someone to learn a language that is very different from the first language. Language universals are those properties of a language that nearly all human languages have in common. Okay, so students have to kind of infer rules as they're going along and as they're being exposed to things. So, forms or rules in the target language that go along with universals that most other languages have, that's going to be easier for students to learn. Okay, like past tense. All languages have some form of showing how to use the past or how to talk about the past. So those are the types of things that are easy for language learners to understand because all languages have them. So language universals help us understand, and they help the learners to internalize those rules. Okay, markedness is something that I talked about in a student's interlanguage. So if something isn't marked, if a form that isn't marked, that means that it's consistent universally. What does that mean? That means that most human languages have it. Therefore, it's not that difficult for the language learner to learn. So, for example, voiceless stops. Okay, that's a sound in our language. They're unmarked because most languages have them. The s sound occurs in most languages. Heads of phrases are common in most languages. Having some sort of tense, present, past, and future is in most languages. The sounds th and th, those th sounds, those are not common. Those are marked. Most languages do not have those sounds. So those are very difficult sounds for learners to acquire in English. So that's what that means. So if something is marked, it means that it's not universal. It's not in most languages. So those are going to be very hard for learners to learn. If something is unmarked, it's consistent. It's in most languages. It's easy for learners to understand. Okay, so one more time. Markedness, that means structures that are inconsistent with language. Okay, so this is a big one that adds to that inner language that students develop. So these are difficult for students to acquire. Okay, so voice stops. So what that means is sounds like b, d, g. Those aren't that common in languages. Th and th, those th sounds, those aren't that common in languages across the world. So those are the things that are going to be difficult for students to learn. Okay, so one more time. So things that interfere with a student's learning and can cause errors are structures that are marked, meaning they're not common in other languages. So they're going to be difficult for students to understand, as well as interlanguage transfer. So students are going to look at the rules that they already know, whether that be from their first language or another language that they've learned. And so that those they may transfer to now the language they're trying to learn, and that's going to cause errors. And that contributes to the development of their interlanguage. So those are things that can, I guess, not really slow down the learning process, but just part of the errors that you'll see that they're making, okay? Along with just some structures, there's an order to development, and every student's different in how fast they can learn new structures. So some errors might just be caused by them not not being ready to move on to those structures, to the next structure. Okay, so what do we do? Do we try to correct grammatical errors? So there's been a lot of debate about whether or not we should try to correct grammatical errors. Okay, some say yes, some say no. I believe that yes, we should try to correct grammatical errors, but the important thing is to not interrupt a student's fluency. So when students are learning, you want them to have a lot of practice in written and in communication. So when students are interacting with each other or interacting with you or talking in big groups, pairs, partners, you never want to interrupt fluency to grammar correct. You can listen, maybe take down some notes, and then after they're done talking, you can go over errors with the class, common errors that you heard, or give students individual feedback, but you never want to interrupt fluency. The other thing is you don't want to overcorrect. Okay, I've found that in, 16, 17 years of teaching ESL, that not all, but most students have what I call a thing. I always tell them, okay, this is your thing. And I usually can get it within the first couple weeks of class. So for example, this student has sentence structure issues. They use a lot of run-on sentences or a lot of sentence fragments. This student often forgets the subject in sentences. This student adds an extra pronoun. Okay, so oftentimes students have one or two errors that they make often. It's rare when I have a student that just has errors all over the place. I might have one or two students like that in a year. Okay, so that'll be that. Those students will need a lot of work. But most students have like one or two mistakes that they make consistently. And so those are the errors that you want to point out to them and have them work on. I never overcorrect. Even when I'm correcting papers, paragraphs or essays, you don't want their papers to be bleeding red with the red pen because that's overwhelming. You want to focus on, okay, do they have one or two errors that they make all the time? And maybe a few others of those. But overwhelming them with like 20 different types of errors per paper, what's that going to do? They're not going to internalize any of that. So your book mentions, is it beneficial to correct errors? And what they seem to really say, and this is how I teach too, is it's better. You want the students to be able to internalize their own errors. Can you help them figure out their own errors, internalize it, and try to self-correct? Because that's the only way that the error is going to go away, is if they can actually internalize it. So what I do is when I'm teaching a new form, I point out common errors as I'm teaching it. I'll say these are common errors that second language learners make and try to show it to them as I'm teaching it. And then also when I'm teaching a form, you want to give them lots and lots of examples of the form in use in writing and speaking. You want them to practice the forms in writing and speaking. And then for them to internalize the rules and the errors and how to correct the errors, you want to give them lots of practice in correcting. So either through peer review or give them examples of sentences with mistakes, and they have to correct the errors and have them talk about what was the error, what did the student do incorrectly here, how can you fix it? And I'll give you examples of those as we go through the different forms throughout the semester.